Namaste, my monological eyeballs. I have been posting Unthink Me videos for about 1 year now, almost exclusively talking about Ken Wilber and integral theory from my own personal perspective. I'm now interested in getting a little more controversial, pushing into criticism of the integral realm and scandals surrounding the movement. I hope to inspire some debate, and possibly a little trolling even. Don't worry, I can handle it. Thus far, I've gotten almost nothing but support and incredibly insightful dialogue, and that basically means to me that I could stand to develop my reach a little further. All good things come to an end, my friends. I'm ripped, come at me. If you aren't familiar with Iceberg videos, the idea is that we go deeper and deeper into the lore of a chosen topic, according to a diagram of an iceberg stretching deep below the surface of the ocean. It's just an internet meme, popular on Reddit and YouTube, just a presentation framework. We will go deeper and deeper into the lore of Ken Wilber's work, personal life, and his various integral communities and projects. We're mostly going to cover trivia, scandals, criticisms, and controversies. I'm unaware of any legitimate secrets or conspiracies more typical of icebergs, but let me know in the comments or get in touch if you know anything, and we can cover all that next time. If I fail to include anything or get something wrong, absolutely let me know in the comments. The power is yours, Planeteers. I want my audience to understand that I make these videos completely out of my own desire. I'm a critical thinker and really pretty shrewd about it. When I talk about my supposed community, I'm not talking about integral, I'm talking about you. People who wonder whether integral is legitimately valid or useful. I'm utterly unaffiliated, uncensored, under no pressure whatsoever. I make no money doing this and don't ever plan to. Here is some background for new viewers. Ken Wilber is a popular and influential author who writes books about philosophy and spirituality. He is also a public speaker and member of various communities and organizations centering around his ideas. He was most popular from the late 80s into the 2000s, but continues to write and gives talks to the present day. His books describe what he refers to as an integral theory of everything, merging all fields and systems of thought into a single meta-theory encompassing all of human knowledge. The bulk of his work describes a progression of psychological stages that all people and all cultures go through, and those who understand and appreciate his work are considered to be at a newly emergent high level of consciousness called second tier or integral, which has the ability to understand these levels and see them in the world. He also explores Eastern spiritual practices, describing himself as an enlightened individual by the established criteria of Vajrayana Buddhist tradition, for example, and gives basic instructions and practices for entering transcendental states of consciousness. He is not a guru and does not personally identify as Buddhist. His integral theory is described as a system of orienting generalizations, necessarily recontextualizing the contributions of historical and contemporary thinkers from innumerable fields. Overall, Wilber portrays the universe, or cosmos, including also consciousness, as an evolutionary process wherein each holon, or evolutionary unit, becomes a more evolved entity via a mechanism of transcending its former self, while also including that former self into its new self, giving the example of atoms to molecules to cells, in the case of physical matter, and expanding that notion into the realm of human civilization and personal development, and even mysticism, so that as a person develops psychologically, they both transcend and include their former identity or worldview into a new, more inclusive one that contains the former whole as a part of its new self. The discussion continues into considerable detail, instantiation, and technicality, as it is attempting to encapsulate and describe all of reality. This video is meant for a general audience, but most of my audience is familiar with what I'm talking about. You may find yourself getting lost in some of the vocabulary I use. I'm trying to avoid that. Feel free to just zone out when I do that, but I have provided explanations for all of these terms in other videos, and it really is pretty hard to not use the vocabulary, which is why it exists, because I'd be in the situation of having to redefine all of these terms in this already excessively long video. That's the reason for the vocab, not to be obnoxious or pretentious or exclusive, but so that I don't have to re-explain the entire history of philosophy and mysticism in every conversation, like, a Jordan Peterson video. As an armchair hobbyist philosopher, I've found integral theory extremely useful, not just for spirituality, but really in every aspect of my life. Hardly any of my personal friends share my interest, many are opposed to it. I'm spreading these terms and ideas out of self-interest to like-minded individuals as part of a larger project of building community for intellectuals who are reasonable and open-minded, emotionally vulnerable and conscientious, seeking meditative states and truly holistic therapies. This is certainly a terrain for hippy-dippy intellectual nerds like me. It isn't for everybody. I'm not the slightest bit cool. The official sanctioned sources concerning the integral movement tend to repeat the same material over and over and present it in a painfully similar way, often repeating the exact same examples ad nauseum. And many of the unofficial sources do too. That's precisely why I wanted to attempt to explore it more in the way that I comprehend it and offer a unique personal voice. I totally understand why people have aversions to integral. That is exactly why I want to come out with this material and invite you to participate in this discussion with me. Ignored by academia. It is often claimed that legitimate academics largely ignore Ken Wilber's work and deem it beneath their consideration. In my opinion, this is often true. Whether such a position is justified would be another discussion. The current state of academics in America somewhat speaks for itself in that regard, with a lot of discussion concerning how institutions might be increasingly compartmentalized and politically compromised. Nevertheless, if you were to ask a pedigreed philosopher or psychologist what they think of Wilber, they will usually say they've never heard of him. If they have, they will often say that his work is too general to be of significance to them, or that Wilber's work has nothing to do with their own. Integral theory, by design, is not rigorous in the same way that academic papers are, and rarely is intended to be defensible within the academic system of peer review. Wilber does not really spend his time that way. Instead, he writes books and gives talks about his meta-philosophy and creates institutions where ostensibly more academic work could be forwarded by others. It is also true that many academics are fond of integral theory, appreciating it as presenting a framework or overview for comprehending all fields, especially philosophy, social sciences, psychology, and spirituality. You can certainly find integral academic papers, and Wilber's books are taught in some classes. It must be understood that Wilber is neither a truly proper career academic nor a spiritual guru. He is just an iconoclastic philosophy author who delves into the sciences and meditative practices, arguably demonstrating a great deal of acumen in both. Bad novels. Wilber at one point claimed that if he wasn't so passionately motivated to do his integral theory work, he would probably get the most joy out of writing bad novels. I do somewhat wonder what he would come up with in science fiction or horror. His sole work of fiction, Boomeritis, is actually just another exposition of integral theory from the tongue-in-cheek perspective of himself as a college student, complete with cameos from many fictionalized versions of his colleagues and friends. To complete the effect, there is a fake author photo of young Ken with hair. Integral Naked. If you had only read his books, you might be surprised to learn that Wilber has an outstanding radio voice, full of wisecracks, very encouraging and insightful, with an effeminate, motherly lilt to his voice similar to that of Terence McKenna. Wilber, as an early podcaster, was noteworthy, in my opinion, for always staying on topic and returning to any unfinished points. Integral Naked was a web-based podcast in the early aughts where Wilber would call celebrity guests and talk about integral theory, as well as whatever topic they might wish to discuss. The list of participants is vast, including Michael Crichton, Billy Corgan, Alex Gray, Sam Harris, Tony Robbins, Serge Tankian, Darren Aronofsky, and Nathaniel Brandon. Support of abusers. As we will cover in greater depth, Ken Wilber's Integral Institute and various related communities have been accused of victim blaming, scandal cover-ups, and support of various types of abuse. It is true that key people affiliated with this community have been accused of sexual, verbal, and financial abuse, and that Wilber and other community members have offered support in many cases, and in some cases have not ended association with these figures under intense pressure to do so. Mark Gaffney and Andrew Cohen are the most oft-quoted and prominent cases, which will be covered lower in the iceberg. Treya Wilber. Ken Wilber's wife, Treya Wilber, was diagnosed with an extremely aggressive form of breast cancer shortly after their marriage in 1983. She died 6 years later, after an intense fight and process of coming to terms with the illness. These events were documented in the book Grace and Grit, a collaboration with Ken Wilber using Treya's journals. In 2021, the book was astonishingly adapted into a film by Sebastian Siegel, starring Mina Suvari and Stuart Townsend. The film is a decent but imperfect telling of the story, lacking to some extent in emotional and intellectual depth, but hitting all of the main beats and remaining faithful to the book. One final Easter egg, Grace and Grit director Sebastian Siegel played a bit part as one of the others in the television show Lost, and was killed wearing a red shirt, a nod to Star Trek. Integral theory is plagiarized. One may make the point that Wilber doesn't actually contribute anything himself. His work is an amalgam of the work of others, including Hegel, Aurobindo, Aldous Huxley, Plotinus, Jung, positive psychologists, developmental psychologists, systems theorists, evolutionary theorists, Arthur Koestler, and a laundry list of others. This is precisely the point of integral theory, exploring the way that all of these disparate ideas might fit together. Wilber's contribution is to assemble the independent work of these authors into one supposed theory of everything. The Ockwell map is Wilber's primary contribution to thought, with quadrants, levels, lines, types, and states. You will find nothing like this elsewhere, anywhere, so it is hard to deny that, at the very least, Wilber has created a diagram of many vast and differing fields of thought. See my 1-minute integral series for a lightning-fast overview of the Ockwell map, or my altitudes theory tutorial for a more moderately paced explanation. Integral is nonsense. This is a common claim of critics, largely just as an attack without really any sort of base or filling in the details of why it is nonsense. Let's see if it is utter nonsense. If you think that you're experiencing the experience of being yourself, looking out through your eye holes, seeing an objective world or universe of some sort, and you also believe that you are both an individual as well as a member of a group such as a species or nation, then you agree with the existence of the quadrants. That's what quadrants are. If you believe in any model of psychological development, or that a human is in some way more complex and developed than a plant, or that civilization has accomplished something throughout history, then you agree that levels or stages exist. If you believe that people can be awake, asleep, or dreaming, then you concur with the existence of states. If you think it is possible to be gifted in anything besides IQ, then you agree with lines. If you think that some people are born men and some are born women, then you agree with types. We have covered all of the bases of the Ockwell model. So is that nonsense? It might be nonsense in practice. It might be useless to some end. But it self-evidently isn't nonsense or incomprehensible. The integral theory simply takes those 5 elements, which we almost unanimously agree on, and puts forth that they are essential to understanding the nature of reality. That's something that you may need to be convinced of, or you may disagree with, but it obviously isn't nonsense. Integral psychobabble. Wilber has created quite a unique vocabulary in his books, one that his readers tend to use because they find it useful. Altitudes, second tier, green meme, red meme, spiral dynamics, Ockwell, post-postmodern, great nest of being, holons, monads, subtle, causal, centauric, quadrants, lines, streams, psychic bands, waves, pre-trans fallacy, on and on. These words are borrowed in some cases and coined by Wilber in others. Holon and related terms come from Arthur Koestler. Many terms come from spiritual teachings and developmental psychology. The definitions for these terms are freely given, and all have a very specific meaning and usage that is meticulously clarified. Someone who hasn't read 1 or 2 Wilber books may find this nomenclature opaque or intimidating, and it may seem threatening that you would have to read a book in order to understand what a word means that isn't used in a conventional way. Sure. If nobody read Freud, perhaps there would be no superego. If one hasn't read Jung or Campbell, maybe archetype is nonsense. Quantum physics and relativity are chock full of made-up words, as is the vocabulary of any scholastic subject. Religious thought is, of course, replete with specific nomenclature. This sort of comes with the territory of advancing thought. Wilber creates vocabulary where our language does not have terms for things. It is very rarely superfluous or gratuitous. I see that using this language can seem pretentious, and if you are to use the language as a sort of clubhouse language to exclude people who don't know integral theory, then you're being an Amber Meme Mythic membership douchebag in a way that Wilber would not condone. Particularly in my own experience, I recall that many an eye was batted when I would be at Denny's restaurant with my friends arguing about whether Maynard from Tool was yellow or green meme. That does sound silly, calling people primary colors, if you don't know what we're talking about, Donnie. But I can fairly easily explain what these terms mean, as I do all over this very channel, and so it isn't psychobabble, it's just nomenclature. Admittedly, there is a lot of it. If you really want to hear vague, nonsensical, made-up words, talk to any present-day critical theorist or social justice warrior. Please understand, the primary purpose of this language is not to waste your time looking it up. It is to save time. A stitch in time saves 9. It is so that we can talk about everything quickly, without having to explain the entire history of thought, without having to reference the connections between every specific comparative religious tradition, without having to contextualize the various movements of culture. I specifically made this channel because I'm impatient with contemporary dialogue and all the retreading of the so-called intellectual dark web. The brain. While attending high school in Great Falls, Montana, Ken Wilber was nicknamed The Brain for his superlative academic performance. Chogyam Trungpa. It is very difficult for me to find a list of who exactly taught Wilber his spirituality. Wikipedia lists 11 primary influences spanning multiple traditions, and I have also seen Wilber describe Chogdud Tulku Rinpoche as his primary teacher. He has clearly worked with many teachers in some small capacity, particularly in Dzogchen or Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, while originally being influenced by Taoism and Zen, though he does not personally identify as a Buddhist. It is hard to draw a line between those teachers he has worked under as a student, worked with briefly in a session or retreat, those he has hosted and condoned, and those where he is simply praising their realization and teachings. Many of these teachers, including Andrew Cohen, Adi Da, Genpo Roshi, and Chogyam Trungpa, are associated with mild to somewhat severe controversies. In many cases, Wilber himself draws attention to these controversies and expresses some disapproval, while still condoning the teacher's spiritual gift. I have read that Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche was a teacher of Wilber's, and also that he was not. Chogyam Trungpa was known for his love of tobacco, alcohol, and women. He once drove his car into a shop, possibly drunk, and it has been claimed that he also used cocaine and other hard drugs. At a meditation seminary Halloween party in 1975 held in Colorado, there was an incident where his Vajra guard brought a poet and his girlfriend out of a locked bedroom and forced them to disrobe, as all attendees were already naked, against their will amidst pleas for help and to call the police. As the successor to Trungpa's Tibetan Buddhist lineage, he chose Westerner Osel Tenzin. Tenzin, who was aware of being HIV positive, was sexually involved with many of his students, one of whom became infected and died. That is his lineage successor, not Trungpa himself. Mark Goffney. Dr. and Rabbi Mark Goffney, I've said Gaffney a few times, but I guess he says Goffney, is a charismatic alternative spiritual teacher affiliated with the Jewish tradition and heavily associated with the integral community. In probably the largest scandal to occur in the integral community, Goffney was accused of numerous counts of sexual assault and misconduct over the course of several decades. In the integral community's heyday, there was an effort to be characteristically inclusive, and thus a tendency to promote, some might say, token representatives of each religion. This is the category I would assign to Goffney as their Jewish representative. I never really got into him myself, so I was never all that curious about this controversy. The first case came out in an article where a woman named Sarah claimed that in the 1980s, when Goffney was 19 years old and Sarah was only 13, he came to her house under the pretense of being a Talmud instructor and pushed himself on her sexually. 20 years later, when Goffney was an established spiritual teacher, this article was published to Goffney's astonishment as it cast him in a very unflattering light, using words like pedophile, rape, and molester. In the wake of the scandal, Goffney came forward with his own side of the story, pointing to numerous inaccuracies in the account and an overall plot to damage his reputation. He went to the extreme of having a number of his statements confirmed by top-notch polygraph testing, if you believe in polygraph testing. He did not deny the incident occurred or deny that it was morally wrong and illegal. His main argument was to point out how facts were distorted, to suggest that bringing this up several decades later was part of a conspiratorial smear campaign, and his stated desire was that the actual truth came through. You can currently find an episode of The Dr. Phil Show where Goffney is grilled about the case, and of course, it is overly dramatized, heavily edited, cherry-picked, and sensationalized with orchestral stings and soundbite clips, but it does actually portray the two sides of the story pretty well. The main inaccuracies of Sarah's story are that she was 14, not 13, that Goffney was not a teacher with that power dynamic, but just a friend, and they would get together and talk about the Talmud because that was their interest. According to him, they were mutually smitten with one another. It was a secret teenage romance. Her parents were in the other room and aware of them being together, although they were not aware that the association was particularly romantic. According to Goffney, what occurred was, quote, necking, while he doesn't seem to argue with the phrase heavy petting, but is vehement that nothing, quote, below the belt took place. So I think I get what that means. He expressed regret over the incident, which at the time in that state was a misdemeanor crime, but he doesn't like it being called felony statutory rape as it was consensual and not a felony in that context. Sarah also sent him numerous love letters following the incident, calling him the love of her life. This was all confirmed under polygraph testing. Goffney considers this incident a misunderstanding, which was distorted perhaps by feelings of rejection and jealousy, and seems to take partial responsibility for the immorality of the age difference. He calls it a big mistake that he made as a 19-year-old guy. It was a huge breach of his religious moral code, it was illegal, and most of us would agree that such an age difference is morally problematic. At any rate, these claims are made somewhat dubious to the extent that their author tends towards the sensational, with claims that the acts were entirely non-consensual in nature, using words like molestation and pedophile to refer to what Goffney under polygraph calls necking, and omitting the detail that this all occurred when Goffney was a youth, not in his adult role as a spiritual authority. Often, when I suggest Ken Wilber, the person I suggest it to will immediately go and find a web page saying Wilber associates with pedophiles, naming Goffney as the first and primary offender, which of course has little to do with Wilber other than his association and defense of Goffney. The second case, and this is also an episode of Dr. Phil, concerns a woman named Judy. On top of pushing forward the case with Sarah, also claims that when Goffney was married and she was 16 and he was 24, he climbed into bed naked with her and urged her to have sexual contact with her, and then to keep the incident secret, and that this occurred multiple times. Again, he admits that they were romantic, but that it was very much her pushing herself on him, that he went with it, but then came to his senses and told her it was a mistake and had to stop, which angered her. He again takes responsibility that it was a foolish and impulsive thing to do, a religious failure and a failure of trust. Both of these cases occurred more than 30 years before the stories surfaced. He was never charged, there was never any complaint, until more than 30 years later when he was a popular, successful spiritual teacher. Third case, as a teacher in the 90s in Israel, he had consensual but forbidden sexual relationships with several students, and he has acknowledged that this behavior was sick and problematic to the school, though he then says that this apology was written by a PR expert, and he only signed his name to it because he was afraid of the Israeli religious institution's extremely harsh treatment of sexual indiscretions. He left the country and fled the institution to avoid persecution, fearing imprisonment and retribution. One dimension in all of this is that Goffney, in his own alternative personal spirituality, is very pro-sex, and he goes against the rabbinical tradition in not being conservative at all concerning the institution of marriage. He sees sex as part of the spiritual experience of life, and when he talks, you get the sense that sex is very important to him in many ways, both personally and spiritually, and that he would probably encourage sexual experimentation and casual sexuality to others with no personal stake in the matter. So, other than the shady incidents with very young women, he is very much like most contemporary people. My own thoughts on the matter, it certainly does seem that Goffney is a horny devil, and he can't seem to keep his sexuality from interfering heavily with his work and reputation. There is no doubt that when he was in his teens and 20s, he was getting involved with girls that were way too young for him. The repression of sexuality in his faith likely played a role in that, as it so often does. Whether that makes him out to be a sociopathic predator or master manipulator, there probably isn't enough evidence available to the public to determine that. I am not seeing a squeaky clean reputation here. What I'm seeing is more someone who struggled with self-confidence growing up. He appears to have serious problems with interpersonal boundaries, and he made some stupid decisions, thinking with his nuts, that it would seem he has now been held accountable for in the court of public opinion, if nowhere else. In general, Ken Wilber and some members of the integral community continue to support Goffney as a gifted spiritual teacher and person of outstanding character, while others do not. There is an enormous petition with hundreds of names on it, particularly traditional rabbis, disavowing and repudiating him and his practices. Nevertheless, he remains a beloved teacher and speaker to this day for many people, not including myself, and he is an important figure in the integral movement. Make of it what you will. The integral cult. Wilber's more vocal critics often portray his character as some sort of New Age cult guru or totalitarian threat, calling him a misogynist, a climate change denier, a fascist, a bigot, on and on. These are flashy headlines with no substance that prey upon intellectual laziness and echo chamber narcissism. However, it is certainly the case that Wilber has always had a very dedicated entourage of devout followers, calling him names from book jacket blurbs such as the smartest man alive, the Hegel of Eastern spirituality, and the Einstein of consciousness. I'll be the first to admit that, like many extremely successful popular authors who discuss topics of self-help, New Age spirituality, and philosophy, Wilber's followers can at times be annoying and pretentious. I'm sure I fall into that category for some of you, and I assure you the feeling is mutual. Wilber does not really seem to encourage or discourage this behavior, he just sort of takes advantage of it in the interest of spreading his ideas and building community. He does advocate the notion that if you are into this, you are special, in that you are a second-tier thinker where everyone who doesn't get it is first-tier. It isn't so much manipulative gaslighting as it is part of the theory. like how a Darwinist would say that if you believe in creation, you must be some kind of pre-rational ignoramus, or how a spiritual guru might say that most people live in a samsaric, self-centered, stupefied trance, not realizing their true nature. There are sort of two types in the integral crowd. Some of them do tend to be more cultish and think of Wilber as the leader of some future movement towards the salvation of mankind, while there are also totally independent, gifted innovators in their own field with their own interests and motives who have found a sort of symbiosis with the integral movement. Among the former, there often can occur a disillusionment and a backlash, and then it snaps back to, Wilber is a megalomaniac, Wilber forced me to work for free, Wilber surrounds himself with an impenetrable inner circle of yes men and women. This is fairly typical in things of this nature. Among his more professional critics, you tend to find that those who legitimately don't approve of his work mostly ignore it, while the ones with a serious axe to grind or chip on their shoulder, who are trying to redeem themselves or make a career out of cutting Wilber down, make the least useful and interesting points, and are of course the most vocal. They seem to be trying to capitalize on Wilber's popularity, if he has that, and it's very tedious to read their criticisms. Wilber is undeniably a confident man, and he presents his ideas as very certain and unassailable even where they are perhaps not. He does tend to address criticism with the view that it is in many cases self-evidently wrong and silly, in the case where that is his genuine position on the matter. If you think of integral theory as some sort of made-up nonsense language, idiosyncratic cult of personality, or mental prison, I would argue that any philosopher's work can be taken and used this way, and certainly this does occur with integral. Speaking for myself exclusively, this is what I have to say. Show me something else that accomplishes the same thing. I've never seen it. It also might be worthy of note to observe the sorts of personalities that are interested in this topic. We're sort of squishy, vulnerable, open-hearted, positive people. So not yes men, because that would imply a lack of critical thought and angst, which isn't true. It's just that when Wilber says something glib and the whole room erupts with laughter, you need to understand that these are the types of people who would do that with anyone. These are New Age spiritualists, tech nerds, artists, and hippy-dippy types. It can devolve into idol worship, but oftentimes it just looks that way because this is a community of very supportive, affirming, encouraging individuals. Avoid Wilber at all costs. If you were to Google Ken Wilber or integral theory with no opinion or frame of reference, many of the first things that pop up are scandals, controversies, and criticisms. This is kind of silly, mostly due to the nature of search engines, as the influence and content of integral far overshadows the relatively small amount of bad press. Just look at Reddit. The general fact of the matter is that when people are first learning about integral, they're most interested to find out what's wrong with it, so they can have an easy opinion to parrot and disregard the immense volume of dense, actual content. As a social experiment, let us see how this video, focused on controversy, is more or less popular than the 87 videos I made simply explaining what integral is without an opinion. We are drawn toward the visceral, the petty, and the personal, and anything that provides a basis for discriminatory ends. I certainly want to provide both sides of the argument if I possibly can. Integral has been affected by cancel culture, with many claims largely overblown, if valid in other cases. I'm not pulling any punches. Given that the primary thrust of Wilber's work is an attempt to comprehend and systematize the practices and knowledge of spiritual gurus and traditional authorities, he does find himself implicated in this realm and its politics. Of course, you absolutely do find claims of abuse, some of which are founded and some of which are more debatable. Wilber discusses guru abuse quite a lot. Spiritual teacher is a very powerful position where you classically would dictate someone else's lifestyle and even the way they think, if you really wanted to be effective. Sometimes this role-playing gets out of hand and becomes abusive on many levels, and at other times, a disillusioned student may find that they wasted a lot of time and energy and money on something that they now believe false, and they resent that they surrendered that power and seek to take down or destroy their former mentor. It isn't really my role to referee your opinion, but what I can do is deliver the facts and details of these cases that we as the public are privy to, and allow you to form your own conclusions on the ethics and morality of each case. Your own judgment of the facts under consideration is entirely a matter of personal choice. I have never seen a guru that I would want to get involved with myself. I again invite my audience to fill in any cracks in the details I provide, but I'm doing my best to play it straight. Blonde Ken. Many people believe that Wilber's characteristically bald head is a show of support for Treya, who lost her hair in chemotherapy. When Ken was a youth just out of high school, he shaved his head to look more the part of a Zen monk. The hair is associated with ego in this context. In recent times, Wilber has taken to wearing a blonde wig that makes him look somewhat like an attractive elderly woman. He comments on the Integral Life YouTube channel that it's just for fun, as a way of playing with the expectations of his audience and of challenging himself, as he has grown very accustomed to being bald. I personally think it looks very pretty. Lexical memory. It is fairly straightforward that Wilber is intellectually gifted in some way, and he tends to be outspoken about what in particular he is good at. According to himself and various observations, he seems to have lexical memory, or an extraordinary aptitude at memorizing written words, being able to speed read several dense tomes in a single day and recite entire sections from memory. I have seen the critical argument made that this is Wilber's only real talent and doesn't serve the sort of meta-theory or model building that has become his namesake. The argument goes that since he is only capable of regurgitating content like a large language model without any capacity for critical oversight, his model is not curated by a mature, skeptical intelligence that would filter out hogwash and garbage. College dropout. Wilber completed high school and enrolled as a pre-med student at Duke in 1967. He then left that to pursue a bachelor's in chemistry and biology and a master's degree in biochemistry from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. From what I can find, sources differ as to whether he actually completed any college degree program, so in that sense, yes, it would seem he is a dropout. According to various sources, he left academics because he found it empty of meaning and decided instead to fully pursue the spiritual path, which at that time was based around Zen and Taoism. Favorite book? When asked about what book he would bring on a desert island, Wilber was incapable of choosing just one, but mentioned first the work of Neoplatonic thinker Plotinus. I suppose if Wilber truly does have lexical memory, bringing a book to an island would be somewhat pointless, as he would have it entirely memorized in a matter of days. Brain dead. In an early example of such things, Wilber submitted to Integral Naked around 2007 and later YouTube a video of himself practicing various transcendental states while connected to a primitive EEG machine, which I believe is the Mind Mirror 3 model. In the video entitled Ken Wilber Stops His Brainwaves, he shows a typical response while waking. He enters a mantra meditation with heavy theta levels, then a delta witnessing state, and finally silences his brain in the exceedingly rare state of nirod, or total cessation of the mind. He also shows how he has abnormally high delta presence in waking consciousness, indicative of a continuous witnessing state. I also cover this in my Brainwaves video, so check that out. Andrew Cohen. Andrew Cohen is the founding editor of What is Enlightenment magazine and founder of Enlighten Next Spiritual Community, which disbanded in 2013. His evolutionary enlightenment teaching focuses on what a person should do once they already have the enlightened realization, and the building of a global community for the enlightened, or those who he would describe as embracing the authentic self and a sense of urgency towards the creative impulse of the universe. He has appeared numerous times in dialogue with Ken Wilber and is mutually considered a member of the Integral community. Several books and even a BBC documentary series entitled How I Created a Cult have described Cohen as a domineering and abusive spiritual teacher. I might be biased because I have very much enjoyed Cohen's mustache, his books, particularly 5 Tenets of Life, and his dialogues, and because he somewhat resembles Bruce Campbell's Ash from the Evil Dead series. The first controversy surrounds Cohen's credentials. Cohen claimed to be an heir of Indian guru H.W.J. Punja, while Punja denies this and says Cohen claimed his own enlightenment after only 25 hours in satsang. While Punja has been criticized for giving away credentials too easily, the teacher himself calls Cohen arrogant and overly egocentric. Cohen's own mother, Luna Tarlow, claimed that being a student in Cohen's group shattered their relationship and that a disturbing and tyrannical side to his character emerged in this context. Then again, imagine having your mother as a member of your basketball team or a coworker in your present job, and probably some new energies might surface for both of you. Without a doubt, Cohen's methods are extremely pushy and bullying, but whether it is fair to call these methods self-serving or harmful would largely come down to the student's goals and expectations. I have read about disturbing simulations of physical amputation, hypothermic baths in ice water, financial manipulation and exploitation, and emotionally disturbing bullying. As indicated, there are several books and a documentary series to explore these controversies. There were no allegations of sexual or drug abuse. For perspective, I highly recommend you check out his recent YouTube videos, where he seems almost brain dead, a shell of his former self, standing out in the yard in the countryside, still speaking the same message as always. I personally find it tragic in nature. Integral theory misrepresents sources. It is undeniable and no secret that Wilber is selective in who he quotes and who he includes as representatives of various fields and theories in his integral model. He aims to include the work of theorists who he views as the cream of the crop, and often those who will be most compatible with his model. He is also very selective about what quotes he cites and which parts of the thinker's theory he wants to use. This sort of selection and pragmatic usage can be seen as dishonest, and often is by critics, but it is to miss the point that he is deliberately trying to synthesize compatible ideas and reject those which are incompatible. So yes, he does recontextualize for sure, and often will take a quote or a part of an idea without keeping the whole thing, thus misrepresenting the author's original intent. This happens a lot. It is not the purpose of integral theory to accurately portray every idea in existence or every idea that is popularly and academically accepted. Because of this, critics often accuse Wilber of misrepresenting sources and cherry-picking. They also accuse him of making straw man arguments of ideas which are incompatible with integral theory. This, again, is a matter of deliberate selection, where Wilber will often take someone like Freud, point out what's wrong with Freud, and still include the main primary accepted points of Freud's theories. This is the way the integral process works, and whether it is sound or not methodologically is in the eye of the beholder. Wife swapping. This was actually difficult to find information on because it was only told in videos and audio that I heard a long while back and actually couldn't find. So this is just from memory. Marcy Gates was a student at Naropa who found herself a personal acquaintance of Ken Wilber. This was a long while after Treya. She then became romantically involved with him, but he did not want to marry or have kids, seeing Treya as the true love of his life. Marcy then met musician Stuart Davis at a gathering, a close friend of Wilber's, and Wilber noticed that the two were hitting it off. Wilber then offered that the two of them should perhaps date, and nobody was particularly opposed to it, even though Marcy claimed Davis was pretty crazy. The two did eventually get married and have 2 children together. She appears in several of Davis's internet shows, including a reality TV show I haven't seen about their quirky, spiritually informed family lives together. Meanwhile, as I also understand, Wilber did eventually remarry a woman who was once Treya's nurse. While this may all seem a bit strange to an outsider, all of the relevant parties see it as natural and an indication of a deep and profound 3-way friendship. If I've got something wrong here, please let me know. Wilber refuses to confront academic critics. This is essentially correct. Writing and defending academic papers can be a full-time job, and Wilber is quite busy with spiritual practice, community building, and of course writing books and giving public performances. Aside from which, it is not really a domain that interests him, which is why he quit college. If he were to attempt to push the entire integral model through the academic system, this would most likely require many lifetimes. What sort of empirical support would even be appropriate to something like that? Meanwhile, he has a decently vast audience and following, as well as a good amount of acceptance for his ideas, so what would be the point? It seems he chooses to spend the time he has left pushing forward with developing, innovating, and elaborating his own theories outside of the academic system, and he is trusting those who are more involved in academia to advance his work at their own discretion. Wilber is wrong. As a totally independent, free-thinking individual, I have to very honestly commit to the observation that there isn't a whole lot of great, juicy criticism out there. Believe me, I've read a lot of it. Attacks on Wilber tend to be somewhat amateurish, petty, personally or politically motivated, and lacking focus. Note, I'm not saying that there are no valid criticisms of Wilber or integral, just that when I go looking for it, I find a lot of overly general, poorly written sour grapes and people trying to advance their own careers or perspectives rather than legitimate, unbiased criticisms of the guy, his work, and his community. As an enthusiast myself, I personally take some issue with the concepts of holons and involution, and feel that a lot of Wilber's work is actually quite incomplete. I get frustrated with his writings and talks in the sense that I would like him to cover certain areas in greater depth, to develop out some of his more unfinished concepts, to stop repeating the same material over and over, to move forward rather than trying to bring in more and more audiences. but that's more a matter of taste than an actual criticism. I would love to see him develop his own unique type system, his own unique meditation practice. Yes, I know he wrote Integral Meditation, but I actually found that book quite baffling. It is basically to meditate upon the levels or stages of growing up, when I was hoping to see a unique and effective twist on levels of waking up or advanced spiritual states. He tends to write about these states poetically, which is cool, but I would like to see him write about them more in the style that he applies to levels in the Aqua model. The worst that I could reasonably say as an overall opinion is that his ideas are pop spirituality, pop psychology, pop philosophy, and are not really intended to be comprehensive, fully rigorous, or academically defensible by design. The focus is too broad, too meta. Whether Wilber is wrong or not, you have to ask, which part exactly? The theory and the model are so general and so generally agreed upon that it's silly when people say simply that Wilber is wrong. Wrong that enlightenment exists? Wrong about stages? Wrong because some well-formed reason? In any case, you're not just calling Wilber, but often several major thinkers, wrong, and that discussion exists in its own little compartment without really affecting anything else. People try to take down the whole thing a la deconstruction and ad hominem attacks, rather than systematically and effectively showing how exactly any particular thing is wrong. Wilber the Gunslinger. One of the most entertaining moments in Wilber history was a series of essays he wrote responding to all of his critics at once. He characterized himself as Wyatt Earp, with everyone wanting a chance to take out the big guy on the scene. This essay, which was more or less just an impulsive blog post, did include expletives and juvenile language, and was quite funny and informative, if not professional by any standard. If you search for it, it is hard to find, buried under everyone else in the world's response to it. The KenWilber.com website appears to currently not exist. The main effect of the post was to add fuel to the fire, with critics predictably curating the off-the-cuff rant as some sort of meltdown or proof of a fragile ego. They cite it to this day as evidence of Wilber's frailty and inability to handle criticism. Don't get me wrong, the diatribe is goofy as all get up, like something Shatner would write if he were more intelligent. But if you really dig into the criticisms he's responding to, he pretty much hits the nail on the head. Rolling updates. Wilber 1 through Wilber 5. Wilber describes his current Aqua model-based theory as Wilber 5, claiming that each version of integral theory was updated to fix minor problems and respond to criticisms. This can easily be interpreted as Wilber was totally wrong about everything 4 times, and now he is once again claiming to be right the 5th time around. It was difficult for me to find a source on exactly what the differences are, particularly Wilber 2 and Wilber 4, but I can say that by and large, the changes mostly come down to framing devices as opposed to actually correcting himself. What he didn't like about Wilber 1, as expressed in his first 2 books, Spectrum of Consciousness and No Boundary, was that they embraced a romantic perspective, which is to say that enlightenment is a return to some primordial state of the past or the unconditioned infant, rather than a movement upwards and into the future as given in the classic 4 quadrants diagram of Wilber 3, typical of a mid-career book like A Brief History of Everything. This distinction may seem major, but he was predominantly talking about the journey of a seeker through spiritual states, and that journey remains constant and supported, whether you consider it an ascent or a descent. By adding a system of stages of growing up, namely spiral dynamics and holons, it is more clear that he is talking about eros, the force of loving progress, as the transformative vehicle. Again, it doesn't really affect your understanding of those books. Wilber 5, as I understand, includes additional modules, with Aqua now having quadrants, levels, lines, types, and states. Again, you can still understand the prior quadrants, levels, and states, and leave out lines and types, and the work still holds up. I mean, it's kind of like every time paleontologists find a new caveman skull, it doesn't really change what we already know about the hominid skulls we already had. It just changes our understanding of the evolution of the species as a whole to a more detailed model. I don't fully understand the differences between the Wilber 1 through 5 systems, but if you know of a good source for a simple breakdown on that, let me know and I'll do a video on it. Ripped Ken. There are pictures of Wilber available where he looks like a nerdy Michelangelo's David, suggesting that he is a self-obsessed object of worship. As I understand, these are actually real photographs. Wilber is committed to what he calls integral life practice, which is a lifestyle program that has modules covering every aspect of life. So that would include not only writing and reading books, his profession, but also things like diet, nutrition, and fitness. The result of this, he did weight training, and he did get quite buff. He is currently a more or less scrawny old man with his health problems, but for several decades he looked humorously out of place in his own community with bulging, veiny biceps and washboard abs. Matrix Trilogy Commentary. In the Ultimate Matrix Collection set, there is actually a full commentary by Ken Wilber with Dr. Cornel West, who is mostly unhelpful but cool, for all 3 Matrix films. This commentary track, if you comprehend it, will completely alter your understanding of the meaning of the Matrix trilogy, particularly the second and third films. Upon first watching, I mostly was amused but not quite as gripped by the 2 latter films, and this remains true, but the commentary really helps you to understand the high concept the Wachowskis were going for, and they really did accomplish it. Everything in those films is deliberate and meaningful, long story short. Wilber is close friends with the Wachowskis, creators of the series, and they do support his interpretation as valid, though they chose not to curate or explain the meaning of their films themselves. Wilber is not enlightened. Of course, there are plenty of people who don't believe that enlightenment exists or is a thing or is vaguely defined in the first place. In that case, there's really no conversation, nobody is enlightened, it's all religious baloney. Part of what Integral does is to actually define for the layman for the very first time what enlightenment actually means. Wilber's claim is that the thing that Eastern traditions claim is enlightenment, he has that, or at least he has had that experience, written about it, and described it. Whether he has full enlightenment all the time forever, that again is a whole debate that could be had. In the traditions, once full supreme enlightenment occurs, it lasts forever, as you have recognized a truth of reality that can't be unseen. In a more integral sense, if enlightenment is a state experience that you can enter in and out of, then there are 2 enlightenments. One which you are in right now, and one which you may remember from your current unenlightened state. Also in an integral sense, there are multiple lines of development which could all express an enlightened ultraviolet or clear light altitude by practicing causal and non-dual states. The causal state is a recognition that you are not your ego and the manifest world is only a part of what happens within a vast void or field of witnessing awareness. That what you are is pure unmanifest emptiness with no form or content or time. The non-dual state is that you are always already in this state, as you are this state, as everything in existence is this state and always has been. If I butchered that, it's because I am not enlightened and have never been, which is false if what I just said is true. Among spiritual teachers, there is little doubt that Wilber has experienced that primary state realization, as they claim it is straightforward to see and detect those who have it. Again, you may call that phooey and confirmation bias or whatever. As mentioned, Wilber has demonstrated scientifically the brainwave pattern associated with realization, although you can point out it wasn't exactly a rigorously set up scientific experiment, but more just a demonstration or parlor trick. And you could point out that achieving a brainwave pattern could be done other ways, which is kind of looking for an explanation for how it can't be valid, which is also unscientific. My current understanding is that Wilber has had causal and non-dual states, so full enlightenment, but that most of his life is characterized by turquoise-level work and lifestyle, and regular access to the psychic state realm with cognitive proficiency in all altitudes. It is probably easier to say that yes, as far as enlightenment goes, he isn't the greatest master who ever lived, but he does have the thing. He is an arhat. And since he is not a teacher of that, his intellectual mind and gift for reading and writing and systemic model building is slightly more impressive and useful to the human race. Victim blame and abuser support. When I have read about Mark Gaffney and Andrew Cohen and various other scandals, I find it often repeated that Wilber and his community claim that these abusive teachers are on a higher level of consciousness and the general public just doesn't get it. I'm not sure where that's coming from. I mean, I'm a person who looks into this stuff quite a bit. About Cohen, the narrative is more that Cohen was trained in and emulating a traditional guru approach, where the teacher is considered a master and ultimate authority, inflicting emotional and bodily harm on a person in the interest of deepening their realization, with the full trust and consent of the student. These deep spiritual realizations are not easy to attain, and they do require a conquering of one's egoic desires, and at least in the traditions of the past, this often entailed physical and emotional abuse, humiliation, and mortification of the flesh. Classically, the master would hit students with a stick and force them to sit for days and days and not eat. You've all seen kung fu movies where master killers in the temple being assaulted and burned and contorted. It's a similar thing to what you might endure in boot camp or special forces training. In the present day, these sorts of things are of course considered abusive and unethical in Western spiritual communities, and it really isn't on the table anymore to discuss whether they are effective. That is the narrative, not that Cohen is innocent or that the general public is just too unenlightened to get it. As far as Gaffney and other sexual controversies, there is a difference between condoning someone's actions and continuing to work with them and support them in their profession. Like, I know in the present day this isn't in vogue, but if my boss at my job was allegedly cheating on her husband, I would utterly disapprove of that, but I also wouldn't quit my job, tell her husband, or try to get her fired. I might even give her positive reviews for her performance specifically as my boss, because that might actually be true. Just because the integral community continued to support Mark Gaffney doesn't mean they support or condone his actions. It's more like they made a measured decision to continue working with him, given all of the details of the scandal I've already outlined, and given their own personal relationship with the man and their own assessment of his character. Some of the community support him, some don't. Without any of us really knowing all the details, it does seem extreme to me to completely cut off all ties with the person and effectively fire them for a criminal sexual act that potentially may have occurred decades prior, or an unprofessional and possibly unethical but perfectly legal set of behaviors that are a bad look for the PR of the organization. But nobody in Integral is saying that it's perfectly fine for a teacher to take sexual advantage of their vulnerable students because they are developmentally superior. That's really not a thing. Quite the opposite. For Wilber to say that Adi Da, for example, had a profound realization is not the same as saying that he morally approves of the man as a person. If Wilber studied with an abusive teacher or had talks with them or quoted or endorsed their work, it's not to say that he is complicit in whatever crimes or abuses they may have inflicted. Likewise, for me to make a channel that teaches integral theory is not at all to say that I support or condone every single thing that occurs in the community or every person that claims membership in it. Similarly, I'm not responsible for the actions or opinions of any of you, nor are you responsible for my opinions and actions simply by watching this video, liking, subscribing, and commenting. This isn't a religion. If you feel morally outraged by God, you do what you need to do as a free conscious agent living in an ethically gray world. Cancel me, cancel Integral, cancel yourself. I don't give a damn. I'm just out here sharing my own awareness while I still can do that. Spiral Dynamics creators disagree with Wilber's portrayal. This is 100% true, and is the reason why Wilber created Altitudes instead of continuing to promote Spiral Dynamics. It's actually quite a convoluted story, and I could fill in the gaps in another video perhaps if you want. In a nutshell, Wilber was aware of this thing called emergent cyclical theory created by psychology professor Claire Graves. Graves's work was continued by a man named Don Beck, and later Chris Cowan and his consulting partner Natasha Torovic. The spiral dynamics model simplified Graves's theory and added a system of arbitrary colors, which I would argue made it much more accessible and comprehensible, but it was really only presented for the purpose of business management, marketing, and other related business concerns. Wilber and Beck considered the scope of spiral dynamics to be considerably broader, and they worked together to promote spiral dynamics integral as a tool for personal growth and an explanation for the history of humankind and cultural trends. This brought some degree of mainstream public exposure to the model for the first time. Spiral Dynamics Integral was the original form of levels that Wilber used in his Aquil model around Wilber 3, but Wilber was of course an expert on developmental levels systems and could have chosen one of any number of them as the primary point of focus for levels. They added several minor features to better fit with Wilber's philosophy, including additional levels to account for stages that weren't yet found in the general public. Cowan and his camp disapproved of these moves, and finally, Beck also came to disagree with Wilber, as Wilber felt that spiral dynamics was only referencing a particular developmental line, the values line, while Beck wanted it to serve more the role of an overall yardstick of development for all lines in all quadrants. This rift was apparently irreconcilable, as Wilber then went on to promote his new altitude system around the time of his book, Integral Spirituality, without Beck's involvement. Altitudes is pretty much exactly what Beck wanted spiral dynamics integral to be, a levels yardstick to measure all developmental lines in all quadrants, except that it conforms to the rainbow spectrum and thus the chakras by tweaking 4 of the colors. Cowan and Todorovic currently own and curate spiral dynamics for its original purpose. While this all may sound a little Game of Thrones, there are a few points to consider. First, Wilber stole spiral dynamics from Beck and Cowan to the same extent they stole it from Graves. And he didn't just swoop in and take it, he was involved at every stage. Also, Wilber's books brought far more attention and exposure to spiral dynamics than anything that any of the others did. Wilber is the only reason you would ever see a random YouTube video talking about any of this. Genpo Roshi. Dennis Merzel, or Genpo Roshi, is an alternative Zen teacher with a unique approach called Big Mind, which focuses on dialogue therapy. This therapy was featured and promoted through Integral Naked. Although precise details vary from source to source, it is confirmed that he had sexual affairs with at least one colleague while also married, and about 6 students have claimed some degree of sexual advance from him, which is a violation of Zen ethics. In response to these claims, Merzel publicly apologized, ultimately disrobed as a Zen priest, and divorced his wife, and continues teaching the Big Mind process as an alternative spiritual teacher. Integral has offered continuous support for Big Mind and Genpo Roshi. Wilber's tombstone. In a typical one-liner gag, Wilber has stated that he has already picked out the epithet that he wants on his grave marker. On my tombstone, he says, I really hope that someday they will write, he was true but partial. Infinity Foundation Spirit Award. In March 2006, Wilber refused the $10,000 Infinity Foundation Spirit Award, claiming the foundation's views were not inclusive enough. Social Darwinism. In glib critical pieces about Integral, you will often encounter the term social Darwinism. Such a term accurately describes a philosopher like Ayn Rand, with very un-PC and negative connotations that they don't care about the disadvantaged, poor, downtrodden, or disabled, and view themselves and their community as deserving of ruling over society because of their moral, intellectual, or even physical superiority. It's like, I kind of see what you did there. Integral overstates the notion of social and personal development, generally calling it evolution. But the vehicle of natural selection really only applies to the animal kingdom, or the order of body in the great nest of being. In Integral, as with memetics, the selection process in the order of mind is not death or physical domination. It is the conquest of more functional and useful ideas, and the death of outdated values and notions. Of course, in any case where you are defining development with stages, this implies a certain type of superiority, namely, that a more developed being is more developed. So this is to say, an enlightened Zen master is superior to an unenlightened average Joe to the extent that you value the enlightened state and those who practice it. An individual with teal meme values is superior to an individual with red meme values to the extent that you yourself value inclusion, flexibility, adaptability, and a global scope of care and concern. If you value personal power and the dog-eat-dog nature of the world, red meme might be superior to teal in your worldview. Postmodern is superior to pre-modern if you believe that civilization has made progress in inventing machines and existentialist thought and cultural criticism. If you think rational science beats mythical religious dogma, then you are a social Darwinist according to this narrative. If you think that consideration for everyone in the world is superior to caring only about the well-being of yourself, you might be a social Darwinist. It's just that that isn't what that actually means. Superior in some way, according to some value system, is not the same thing as let the degenerates die due to their weakness. They're kind of different. Is it superior to have a higher IQ than to have a lower IQ? Is modern racial equality superior to 1920s racism? Integral doesn't really focus on notions of superiority. It does, however, focus on growth vectors and says that a person can develop or grow along that particular vector or developmental line towards greater inclusivity, not domination. The second-tier integral perspective is defined as an acceptance, inclusion, and compatibility with all other developmental altitudes, not a superiority over them or entitlement to rule them. At the same time, as we see with the development of rational science or the postmodern informational age, each step along the altitude scale does come quite naturally with new powers and abilities, and the abuse or compassionless use of these is seen in Integral as shadow, described as pathological in Ken Wilber's books. Songs about Wilber. The soundtrack to Ken Wilber's life is provided by singer-songwriter and Wilber's close friend, Stuart Davis. Among other exploits, including comedy shows, accounts of extraterrestrial encounters, and his own made-up language called Is, Davis has produced many outstanding songs concerning integral theory, including a 3-song cycle about the process of dying inspired by Grace and Grit and the death of Treya Wilber. Only qualified to wash dishes. Wilber has made the humble remark that the only thing he is actually qualified to do is wash dishes. This is due to his abandoning formal studies and working as a dishwasher at the Red Rooster family restaurant in Lincoln, Nebraska, while preparing to write his first book, The Spectrum of Consciousness, at the age of 23. Integral Cult Echo Chamber. Ken Wilber's books tend to appeal to a certain type of person, and that type of person is not all that common. This type of person tends to enjoy complex intellectual topics, complicated theoretical models, mystical spiritual systems, advanced vocabulary, and all of these have a certain natural element of exclusivity, since most people are not interested in committing to the investment of learning all of this crap. This has the effect that if a person is interested in Wilber at all, they're often very passionately interested. It is very common to hear that reading a book by Ken Wilber was a life-changing event. Because of this, Wilber's fans tend to be thirsty for other Wilber fans. They tend to speak a common language, that is, the terminology from Wilber's books that I'm using here, and they tend to approve not just of some sentiment or slogan or aspect of Integral, but really embrace the whole thing in all of its complexity. This does create the effect of a literal cult, as in like a cult film, like Rocky Horror Picture Show. If you like Rocky Horror at all, that often means you love it. You know all the songs, a lot of the lore, you probably have dressed up and attended a showing with the various prescribed rituals, and you're eager to get together with other fans. This can also be said about bands like Tool, Primus, Ween, or Phish, movies like Evil Dead or Star Wars, Star Trek, comic books, Dune, sports teams, video games, Alex Jones, Oprah Winfrey, Joe Rogan, Donald Trump. You get the idea. But it also creates the sense that this is some sort of brainwashed mind control community that indoctrinates its members and teaches them a bunch of random nonsense jargon to separate them out from the community at large and make them feel special. According to Integral, this would be definitively red and amber meme mythic membership absolutist low first-tier behavior, not Integral second-tier behavior, characterized by a fluid, dynamic, and open-ended sense of self that embraces as much as possible and excludes as little as possible. As I said before, Integral can be used cultishly, as can any of the aforementioned cult phenomena, and I would argue that it does create a sort of echo chamber, as does any philosophical or political or spiritual movement. These days, just about anything is an echo chamber, because we get all of our information from dumbass social media such as this. More to the point, I do see in Wilber's fans a tendency to focus on the same things as Wilber. They might tend to tread the same ground, repeat the same slogans, etc. This is why many other fans of Wilber's work, such as myself, hesitate to identify with the community and seek to bring it into new domains and pursuits. Finally, in spite of all that I have just said, I would say that the typical Wilber fan is not the typical Wilber fan. I mean, even just consider the enormous variety of people engaging with my channel. If you look for Wilber on YouTube, you will find Wilber nerds, but you will also find the psychedelic community, conspiracy people, New Agers, culture and lifestyle influencers, self-help and business gurus, general philosophy enthusiasts, naturalists and ecologists, historians and anthropologists, artists and musicians, religious practitioners, diverse celebrities like Alanis Morissette, Al Gore, and Deepak Chopra, and you will probably notice that they come from all over the world and often have heavy accents. Mean Green doesn't exist. I deem this one worthy of consideration. In his heyday, Wilber was extremely focused on a particular point about the green meme, sensitive, multicultural stage of development. Because they are so inclusive and egalitarian, they often include lower memes indiscriminately into their midst and tend towards romantic views of history and condemnation of modernity. When you get involved in the psychedelic community, as in people who use marijuana, DMT, ecstasy, psilocybin, and LSD as means of exploring consciousness and altering their worldview, you're also getting involved to some degree in the illicit drug community, including organized crime, drug abuse, psychosis, and antisocial activities. When you organize a peaceful protest in a public setting, you open the door for any old angry person with no ideology to scream and shout and riot and vandalize and loot as part of a mob. When you say that all perspectives are equally valid, you open the doors of academic institutions for utterly misanthropic, uneducated idiots to spew hateful nonsense. This is the idea of mean green meme. Wilber was talking about it in the 90s and 2000s, when hardly anyone ever would have guessed how crazy it would get. Personal note, I am a refugee of Portland, Oregon. My car was stolen 3 times. The police weren't allowed to do anything about it. I could go on. These days, the king of busting mean green meme is clearly Jordan Peterson. But does it actually exist? Is there really such a thing as a cultural neo-Marxist or PC thought police? Well, it might be more useful to consider what green meme actually is. Actual green meme tends to be very educated, very sensitive, very chill and calm and intellectual. The trouble isn't with green meme per se, it is with magenta, red, and amber meme posing as green meme, and orange meme exploiting it commercially. It is movements with no message, no leadership, no principles but to take things down or take people out. It is not deconstruction, but just straight-up destruction. Not anarchy in the sense that we are peacefully self-governing and don't need parents anymore, but anarchy in the sense that there are no rules because I say so, now I can do whatever I want. It is exploitation, it is tribalism, it is mob mentality. It is precisely what you see all around you in today's politics, today's economy, today's journalism. It is everything to do with what we are seeing and feeling as a global information age civilization. What else would it be? My point is, it really has less to do with green meme and everything to do with the entire first tier's lack of self-awareness. So, does second tier help this situation? Would it be useful to identify where everyone is coming from and what motivates them to do what they are doing? Every first tier meme is quote-unquote mean, because it results in everything wrong with the world we're experiencing, and everything that has always been wrong with it. Of course, wrong is a silly word to use, because there is nothing wrong with the world or the first tier. Everything is functioning how it intends to function. Everyone is doing exactly what they think is the right thing to do, according to their own altitude. That is the second tier perspective. It thinks we would be more willing to work together with greater self-awareness. Kermit the Frog. This one's dumb, but Kermit the Frog is a contributing member of the Integral Movement, appearing on multiple occasions to praise Ken Wilber and be interviewed by Stuart Davis. Chronic fatigue syndrome. In 2011, Ken Wilber stated that he has a chronic fatigue syndrome called RNase enzyme deficiency disease. Some critics have claimed that this condition is no more than the despondency, writer's block, and hypochondria that affects many self-employed career creative types. Chronic fatigue syndrome is an umbrella term that describes little more than an overall sluggishness and lack of motivation and focus, which means that it can describe conditions that are psychological or psychosomatic in nature, and also those that may be caused by one's physical and mental health in general. They may be caused by grieving and depression, and they may be caused by bacteria, viruses, or organ or digestive failures that are more genetic in nature. The condition started while Treya was still alive, and Wilber attributes it to environmental contagions present in the area where he lived around Lake Tahoe and Boulder, Colorado. In one case, he lost consciousness and fell down a flight of stairs, resulting in hospitalization. There was an approximately 5 to 10 year period in the 2010s when Wilber was clearly suffering physically, losing his characteristic buffness and becoming frail, scrawny, and more wrinkly. During this time, he continued to write and give talks, but it was clear that he was either in great pain, slightly disabled, or on medication, because his speech was halting and labored. In my opinion, all of his work suffered during that period. I'm glad to see that in more recent times, he appears to be mostly convalesced with clear, articulate speech and writing, and that spark of confidence, energy, and brilliance returned to his eyes and voice. At this time, he is in his mid-70s and appears to potentially have several decades of life left in him. Medieval views. The integral view attempts to include relevant material from the entire history of thought. And so it is common for critics to point out that Wilber exposits notions that are clearly rejected and condemned by modern schools of thought. This includes many Buddhist notions that are nearly 2,000 years old or more, with discussion of reincarnation, rebirth, and Bardo realms not being off limits. And Wilber appears to genuinely believe in all of these in some form, although it is not the subject of his writing much at all. He also includes the notion of a great chain of being in his theory, which is a medieval model of reality originally going back to Plato. The chain begins with God and descends through angels, humans, animals, and plants to minerals in the Christian tradition, but exists in various iterations among many traditions all over the world. It's one of those ideas that pops up everywhere. Wilber's model is updated to a holarchic great nest of being with holons spanning from matter to body to mind to soul to spirit. In a very basic sense, it is to say that compounds contain molecules, contain atoms, contain subatomic particles, contain quarks, etc. in matter. Body, or life, takes those molecules and builds them into cells, which build tissues, which build organs, which build creatures. We then get into the realm of mind, with altitudes of holarchic development along various lines and the quadrants co-evolving as worldview, culture, brain function, and social institutions, the things that are unique to humankind on Earth. Soul refers to the entire psyche, or total mind, including that which is unconscious or subconscious, while spirit refers to the unmanifest emptiness or ultimate suchness of reality. So these are metaphysical notions at worst, not anthropomorphic personifications of God or superstitions or anything like that, which may be implied by the classic model. One of Wilber's favorite philosophers of all time is Plotinus, whose ideas were influential in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. He is considered a Neoplatonist, which is a term that is also sometimes applied to Wilber. With the Protestant Reformation, Neoplatonic ideas of oneness and the self were rejected as overly Oriental and remained that way for many outside of Gnostics and some pockets of academia. A common theme that pops up in Wilber's views, and indeed is built into the Ockwell integral model, is the notion that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. This is a pre-Darwinian idea that is very often vehemently rejected by modern scientists, but personally, I find it not only compelling, but self-evident. The basic idea is that the life of an individual person, such as yourself, encapsulates or recapitulates the entire history of life on Earth. At some point, the thing that would become me was molecules of nutrients my parents consumed, and so I was molecules. And of course, those molecules were atoms and quarks, etc. I then was manufactured into a sperm and egg cell in my parents' bodies, becoming similar to the single-celled life forms that emerged in the primordial soup of our planet. When the two cells merged, we became a multicellular life form. That life form then underwent mitosis until I had various tissues and organs, just like how cells on Earth evolved into plants, fungi, and invertebrates. I then grew a spine and was somewhat fish-like, living in the fluid of my mother's uterus. My fetus body formed the hair follicles, genitals, and systems associated with warm-bloodedness, making me turn from an amphibian-like creature into something like a little monkey at the time of birth. As an independent human being, I then behaved and thought fundamentally like a caveman, with no language or enculturation, and proceeded through magical, mythic, and finally rational systems of mental functioning, mirroring the development of civilization. What this all means in integral is that the same structures that evolved in the collective of life on Earth also evolved in your individual particular case in the story of your life. You have lived the partial history of the cosmos in yourself, greatly accelerated, of course, and avoiding any turns that didn't add a holon to your being. These holons, or building blocks, or in the case of mind, memeplex structures, are the very same ones in all four quadrants, in the individual and the collective, the subjective and the objective. Again, most evolutionary scientists absolutely reject this theory and call it antiquated pseudoscience nonsense. Personally, I think it's silly to think of a sperm cell as a primate homunculus rather than a single-celled organism, to think of a fetus as a human when it has almost nothing in common with a human and various things in common with an amphibian, and to consider a 7-year-old an incomplete rational agent rather than a mythic-level absolutist, membership-centered human mind, just like all Christian people were before entering industrial-era rational education systems typical of representative democracies. Wife beater. In the Grace and Grit novel and movie, there is a depiction of Ken Wilber striking his mortally sick wife Treya when she refuses to leave his work area and pleads for his attention. This is clearly a true autobiographical account, and one which is obviously steeped in heavy regrets and shame. There are no other accounts of Wilber ever being violent in any way. Stage theories are racist. Green meme, or postmodernism and multicultural sensitivity and cultural criticism, arose intellectually around the turn of the 20th century and came to cultural prominence in the love generation of the 1960s in America as a mainstream movement. It is extremely popular and influential at the present time, particularly in internet culture and academic institutions, although in each of these expressions it looks and behaves quite differently. What Wilber calls boomeritis, so named because it seems to have affected the baby boomer generation most noticeably, is a total rejection of all hierarchy, a condition also comically described as flatland, or a perspective lacking in either what you could consider vertical height or depth. Most of us agree in the fundamental equality of all people, that everyone deserves a chance, everyone is worthy of love and care, everyone has the potential to do good in the world and be a contributing member of society. We tend to believe in inclusion to some extent, usually with limits. Boomeritis, or flatland, takes it one important step further, in that everybody is radically equal in every way. And if you don't agree with that, then you're a bigoted, racist, sexist, colonialist, or any other ist we could name. Ironically, in that very same move, a hierarchy is formed, where inclusiveness is good, better, more progressive, superior, and the bigot is bad, wrong, regressive, ignorant, and inferior. And so, witch hunts and crusades occur where a certain group is persecuted or attacked or othered or bullied because they have engaged in that very same unforgivable activity. The truly flatland boomeritis perspective, or what Wilber has called mean green meme, to some extent comes from a position that all people are radically equal in every way, and in parentheses, except for everyone who disagrees with that. So, nobody is smarter than anybody else. Nobody is stronger or more moral. A convicted serial killer is the very same quality as a saint, but the conditions of poverty and lack of access to alternatives caused the crime, while privilege and unfair economic distribution accounts for any human betterment, which of course can't exist. Thus, of course, from this viewpoint, any stage theory is intrinsically the root of all evil, saying that a person can be overall more developed cognitively or morally or in their comprehension of self or reality or nature or spirituality. It is once again the patriarchy placing everyone in self-selected buckets in order to dominate over them in a caste system or wage slavery, rather than the work of independent scholars, psychologists, biologists, and social scientists who all fundamentally agree to some extent that people do show differences in capacities, and development of some sort is occurring. Again, this funhouse mirror version of equality really isn't a green meme perspective, but instead one that tends to co-arise with it among pre-rational perspectives piggybacking on green meme slogans and social movements. See communism. The rational orange meme perspective certainly does approve of hierarchy, acknowledging the talents of individuals, the efficacy of organizations, the value of education, the moral condemnation of criminality, that IQ does exist and mean something, and that men have an advantage of some sort in athletics that were originally designed for men to compete in, which is why men's and women's sports exist in the first place, and why transgender participation in these sports does raise moral issues. Wilber has boomeritis. Wilber is technically a boomer, and he does emphasize inclusiveness in all of his work. From the perspective of orange meme rationality, wherein you don't believe in the existence of the second tier espoused by Wilber, it would follow then that Wilber is nothing more than another new age, multiculturally sensitive, pluralistic, postmodern social critic standing in the way of scientific and industrial progress, being some sort of weak, nice guy with weird pseudoscience ideas about transcending the mind with consciousness instead of emphasizing winning the game of money, success, and the pursuit of happiness. His work of tearing apart the entire green meme deconstruction movement, coining the very term boomeritis, is itself an act of deconstruction inspired by his own latent boomeritis. I don't really see how any of this works logically, but there, I've delivered it for your consideration. Wilber stops his brain is a hoax. All over Reddit and YouTube, the most common response I see to the astounding Wilber stops his brain video is that it's phony. It should be noted that in recent times, it is a popular meme for monks or meditators to hook themselves up to EEG or other brain instruments and demonstrate various supposedly transcendental states. Critics will ask why Wilber did his video in some random hotel room with a relatively cheap device and poor video equipment, rather than in a professionally controlled laboratory under more scientifically defensible conditions. I agree with that. He should have done that. When this video came out, I had never seen anything like it before. It seems like something he just sort of did on a whim, really, not some big plan to prove to the world that enlightenment is real, which in my case it kind of was that. Now, keep in mind that the hoax commentary I'm referring to is not academic papers or academically accepted platforms, but rather comments on Reddit and YouTube. But anyways, commenters come forward as some sort of scientist or medical specialist that uses the equipment all the time. They might say that the machine used, the Mind Mirror 3 unit, is more or less a toy or false EEG machine. Wilber himself describes the machine as somewhat of a crude household amateur machine, not professional medical equipment. I'm open to the possibility that this is bad science, but I have to say there is plenty of motivation to criticize Wilber, and for any serious student of brain science, this would seem an easy mark if such claims are true. They'll tend to point out that he may have cheated the responses we see by jostling the equipment, by flexing muscles near the electrodes, or that he may have simply disconnected the machine in some way to achieve the flat response. In other cases, they claim that nobody in the world could achieve these states as quickly as he does, perhaps not noticing that the footage has been sped up because it did take Wilber some time to get there. While I agree with this questioning, these attempts to call out bad science and such, I think it is more to say that I'd like to see more and better videos like this, rather than to say that this one is in some way a deliberate ruse. As I said, there are in this time, 20 years later, numerous videos like this and much greater scientific interest in the topic of brainwave science applied to meditative states. I think the Ken Wilber video is, at this time, somewhat of a quaint curiosity, and above all, a milestone or a call to action to encourage others to continue this work, which it seems was quite effective. Scientifically, there really is no argument anymore that meditators do access these alternative brainwave patterns, regardless of what that means or how you interpret it. I did a whole video on this topic, so feel free to check it out. I have never seen a cogent or valid claim that this video is fake, other than said offhand comments on Reddit and YouTube, often coupled with unprofessionally harsh criticisms of Wilber's personal character and opinions on meditation and the integral movement. You also find quite a few equally invalid claims in support of the demonstration. As I said in my other video, I would love to see proof of a hoax. That would be somewhat of a holy grail. It would mean a great deal to me. I'm sure valid brain science researchers would love to provide it. I've been looking for it for quite a while. Please point the way to me and others who believe this video is valid and legitimate, if limited. Adi-Da. Adi-Da, known by various names including Franklin Jones, Bubba Freejohn, and Da Freejohn, was a San Francisco alternative spiritual guru who died in 2008. There is little relationship between Wilber and Adi-Da other than that Wilber wrote forewords to his books, considers him a profound spiritual adept, and has used some of Adi-Da's concepts and formulations, and has expressed disapproval of the man's morality. There are numerous claims of fraud, extortion, drugs, sexual, emotional, and physical abuse, and manipulation that have been leveled against Adi-Da and his Adi-Dam cohorts. It is hard to tease apart which of these are fraudulent, exploitation, or misunderstandings. It was an alternative guru cult which was exclusive and people were supposedly free to leave, quoted as hard to get in, easy to leave. What we can say is that this was a sexually active community that certainly did use sex, humiliation, and physical and emotional intensity as a form of spiritual practice, and that it may very well have engaged in illegal or unethical activities, depending on your definitions of ethics, and the group did worship Adida as the ultimate god on earth and the greatest realization ever.